The just released report from the Pentagon, climate change and the challenges it's creating for the military.
The latest report says global warming is driving weather to new levels of extremes.
A growing threat to national security.
The predicted consequences of a warming world are already with us.
Climate change and natural disasters can cause humanitarian crises, population migrations.
Scarcity of water, food, and space could lead to failed states, instability, and potentially radicalization.
Senator, there's no question that environmental security can have a dramatic effect on overall security, both in individual states and regionally.
Never before have so many people fled war and persecution.
This is climate change far beyond the melting ice caps.
Global climate change, while not new to history, is new to the modern world. It can significantly add to the challenges of global instability, hunger, poverty, and conflict. The effects of climate change are far-reaching and unpredictable, demanding our attention and strategic thinking. The U.S. Department of Defense is preparing to adapt to these 21st century challenges.
The intersection of climate change and the security of nations will become a defining reality in the years ahead. We cannot ignore the costs of inaction, and we cannot leave these massive security concerns to the next generation. We are now in the age of consequences.
Think about it from a military perspective. When I was leading paratroopers in Afghanistan, if 98, 99% of my intelligence told me that I was driving my platoon down a road and that 2 miles down that road, there's an ambush waiting for me, I don't get to say, yeah, but there's that 1% that says there's no ambush, so the hell with the other 99%, we're gonna keep going down the road. I mean, that's negligence on an unfathomable scale. That's the debate we're having right now with regard to climate. The overwhelming consensus is we are facing a massive risk. Climate change is happening. We've got to decide whether they're going to act on it or not. And that choice has consequences.
Climate change impacts the basic resources that are necessary for humans to survive and for nations to continue. As we see our resources stressed significantly, we're going to see some unprecedented changes that we have to prepare for. The risks of climate change impact on every facet of life. They impact on every facet of national security and of international security. That makes instability, that makes conflict much more likely.
The first time I thought about climate change and violence was in Afghanistan while researching opium poppy, from which heroin is made. Every time I interviewed farmers, they said part of why we grow this crop is because it's drought resistant. Turns out Afghanistan is going through the worst drought in living memory, and poppy uses 1/5 the amount of water that wheat uses. The Karzai government were eradicating poppy. The Taliban, on the other hand, said to the farmers, we will defend your right to grow this crop. Even in that conflict, which has this elaborate history, there is a climate aspect. It's always a question of how climate change interacts with other pre-existing problems.
If you have an area that is already unstable and then has the additional challenge of sea level rise, extreme weather events, water shortages or food shortages or a disaster that makes people move, then you can start seeing conflict situations. It's all the underlying conditions. Climate change is the stimulus or the catalyst that can cause all of that to agitate and become conflict.
From my perspective as a former member of the United States military and 30+ years of service in uniform, climate change is what we call an accelerant to instability. It is what's causing a lot of the conflict or helping assist the conflict that's going on around the world. And you can see that on the front pages of the paper virtually every day.
If we look around the world today, we can already see conflict and climate in play, right under the headlines that we're reading.
The International Red Cross is now designating Syria's deadly conflict to be a full-blown civil war.
Think about relationships we don't often look at. The civil war in Syria, now going on for years. Hundreds of thousands dead. The entire region is in chaos as a result.
A new study finds climate change exacerbated the worst drought ever in modern Syria as a consequence of human interference.
Professor Richard Seager says that a 3-year drought played a huge role in pushing the Syrian people into an all-out civil war.
This is the first study that quantitatively draws a connection between climate change and the onset of a conflict. Syria began to experience a serious multi-year drought in the winter of 2006-07, and that drought lasted for 3 consecutive years. Farming families just cannot survive on the land when a drought lasts that long.
As people try to feed their families and can't, they've got to go somewhere.
The drought caused a large number of young Syrian men in particular to leave farmland and go to the cities.
Damascus, Aleppo, 1.5+ million people had to move.
That has a major destabilizing impact when people have to pick up and leave, whether it's because of conflict or resource scarcity. As anyone can tell you, a bunch of unemployed young men in a major city is not a recipe for social stability.
Now, Syria had already absorbed about 1.5 million refugees from Iraq who were fleeing the civil war there. Those numbers combined such that the population of Syrian cities grew by about 30% or more. That rate of migration is absolutely catastrophic. It drove food prices up, it drove apartment prices up, strained the health system, all leading to the kinds of conditions of discontent to the all-out civil war that is still going on now. When we analyzed all the precipitation data we could get, we found that we just couldn't attribute such a long and serious drought to natural climate variability alone.
That particular drought was 2 to 3 times more likely because of climate change.
We, of course, did not say drought was the sole cause of the Syrian civil war. It's the confluence of multiple causes coming in, with climate being one of them.
Climate change is all about the water. So we have climate change leading to rainfall variability. We don't necessarily know when the water is going to come. We can't predict that we're going to get the same amount of water as we used to get. And that is going to have a huge impact on whether or not we can grow food. So in the case of Syria, we're talking about how climate change impacts water resources, how that impacts food resources, and what that means for what people do for a living, whether it's farm, herd animals, or join a terrorist organization.
This is a city draped in black, and a city raging with anger.
This is ISIS, the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria.
As people moved into those cities in Syria, they were unemployed, didn't have a source of food, they needed to feed their families. ISIL promised them both those things. Despite the philosophy behind their organizations, people want to survive first.
ISIS was pre-existing in the region and would have existed even if there had not been a drought in Syria. But once the Syrian society began to unravel, every actor within that region saw an opportunity to try to use the crisis to advance their pre-existing agenda.
ISIS has certainly taken advantage of scarce water resources, creating leverage over local populations.
ISIS has just taken over a dam near the key city of Ramadi, shutting it down and preventing water from reaching two key towns. Their goal to, quote, kill people of thirst.
They're securing access to river towns, they're securing access to water supplies, and it's driving their strategy.
Water becomes an instrument of war for these people who are looking to take over. You control the water, you control the livelihood of the people. Climate change is going to impact the amount of water, it'll impact who controls the water, that'll impact the instability.
The climate change that we're going to be experiencing over the next few years is way in excess of what we've experienced up to now. And I think the Syria case is a real wake-up for what the consequences can be, and this is really early on in this game.
It's in the U.S. national interest to ensure that there's a stability globally. Those are things that can come home to us.
You can always look at Syria and say, well, it's ISIS, or well, it's Assad. Yes, it is ISIS. Yes, it's Assad. But there's a backdrop which has to do with climate. That's going to happen over and over and over again. Each time we'll have a different political or ideological story to tell. Each time it will be true. And each time the underlying factor will be climate.
When you talk about climate change, it's a national security challenge in the broadest possible sense, in that these changing weather patterns over time are going to affect the way we live. They're going to affect our food supply, our water supply, the heat of the environment we live in. Security in the broadest sense is about all the things that we care about day to day. Are you safe? Can you feed your family? Can your children go to school? When you talk about climate change as a national security challenge in the military sense, you're talking about how does it affect what the military has to do, the missions it goes on, or support here at home. How does it affect what they need to be ready for in the future?
We all know that human activities are changing the atmosphere in unexpected and in unprecedented ways.
I first saw the effects of national security and national defense in Somalia in the early 90s. The essential nature of that conflict was originally caused by drought and a lack of food, simply stated. And we begin to see a major trend. Climate change is one of the variables that must be considered when thinking about instability in the world.
I'd like to turn now to Sherri Goodman. She served as Deputy Undersecretary of Defense for Environmental Security.
Like many of you probably now, you want to work on the big issues of the day. That's what I wanted to do. So I was in the field of national security. Nuclear weapons and arms control were the big challenges, but it was actually during an era when environmental issues began to be implemented in places like the Defense Department. At the turn of the century, there began to be recognition that there was a nexus between what's happening in climate change and national security.
We've seen this estimation of climate change as a significant risk since the early days of the George W. Bush administration. The very first report from the Department of Defense was in 2003 that identified the potential national security implications of abrupt climate change.
I was asked to take on this challenge directly in about the 2006 timeframe, and so I gathered the nation's leading retired military officers.
As a group, we are not your traditional environmentalists.
CNA's Military Advisory Board is a group of senior retired admirals and generals from all 5 services that have changed the conversation.
The view of the Military Advisory Board is that we can't wait until we have absolute certainty. If we wait, we might wait too long.
We released our initial report, National Security and the Threat of Climate Change, in 2007. We realized that climate change would be a threat multiplier for instability. As people become desperate because they have extreme weather and the seas are rising and there are floods in one area and droughts in another, fragile states become more unpredictable.
That was definitional. When that study came out, it really set a baseline for how to talk about this issue.
One of the key recommendations of the CNA report was to incorporate the consequences of climate change into a national intelligence estimate.
In 2008, the idea that came out of that report was climate change exacerbated existing societal tensions.
Social tensions and economic costs could lead to state or regional instability threatening U.S. interests. It could contribute to inter and more likely intra-state conflicts.
Climate change as a threat to national security worked its way into the highest level strategic document produced by the Department of Defense.
The Quadrennial Defense Review, the Pentagon's bedrock strategic document, has consistently identified climate change as an accelerant of instability or conflict.
It was really the first time that climate change was addressed at that level. We now see this signed out by the Secretaries of Defense.
The Climate Change Adaptation Roadmap identified climate change as posing immediate risks to national security.
2014, we found that the risks of climate change are continuing to accelerate and that they are now a catalyst for conflict.
We've turned the corner, and we really see that climate change is one of the big issues of the 21st century.
I can remember once getting in a discussion with a career civilian at the Department of Defense who was expressing concern about talking about climate change and said, we have to use language that doesn't, offend people, that doesn't say this is really happening. And I just looked at him and I said, that's incompatible with US government policy. And I, cited all these reports and said, you need to look at what your own government is saying and work from that.
We're going to begin by recognizing Rear Admiral David Titley, who was a member of CNA Military Advisory Board. Whenever you're ready, please begin.
I'm here today not only representing my views on security implications of climate change, but on the collective wisdom of 16 admirals and generals. Sir, our collective bottom line judgment is that climate change is an accelerating risk to our nation's future. These serious impacts to our security will only continue to increase in both frequency and consequence. Failure to think about how climate change might impact our globally interconnected systems and all elements of US power and security is frankly a failure of imagination.
There's a tendency to separate thinking about domestic events from international events as if that was a real barrier. What we do in this country has a strong impact on people elsewhere in the world and vice versa. So you really have to start looking at reciprocal interactions between events in different parts of the world. When it comes to something like climate change, you begin to worry about phenomena that you weren't counting on kicking in at some indeterminate level.
Russia is on fire. More than 500 wildfires raging across the drought-plagued country.
The heat wave has ravaged farmland and destroyed crops over an area the size of Portugal.
This disaster could destroy one of the nation's biggest exports, wheat.
In 2010, there was a major drought which led to heat waves in Russia, in Ukraine, and in China, which really devastated the wheat crop in those countries.
It's the worst drought in 200 years. China's in a crisis, but this is one for the world to watch.
Commodity traders have reacted to the fires and drought by pushing up the price of wheat to a 23-month high.
China, Russia started buying a lot of wheat on the global food market, drove the prices up significantly.
Because food is traded globally, food prices can be influenced by what's going on all over the world. If you are buying bread in Damascus or in Cairo, that grain has been traded on an international market. So it is sensitive to climate fluctuations from Kansas to southern Australia and in Uruguay and Argentina. What happens globally matters.
Globalization is inherently unpredictable. Since agricultural commodities are all in one global market now, what China does when it panic buys is it affects markets all over the world.
Large shocks on the global food supply will always affect the most vulnerable people, because when the prices are being determined internationally, the food will go to those people who have the most money. Inevitably, the poorer of the world will be the ones who bear the brunt of any shortfall.
Now, Egypt is one of those countries that's heavily dependent on the global food market.
With a population of more than 80 million, the demand for daily bread is high. It has made Egypt the world's largest importer of wheat.
In a number of areas around the country, the price of wheat went up 300%.
In a country that has to import more than half the wheat it needs, flour has started to look like gold dust.
Russia stopped exporting wheat to the Middle East during that period.
Due to abnormally high temperatures and drought, I believe it is reasonable to introduce a temporary ban on grain and wheat product exports from the territory of the Russian Federation.
When they cut that wheat off, things became very unstable.
This is what popular uprising looks like. Protesters demanding bread and freedom and calling for government officials to step down.
If you either don't have food or you have food, but now you have to pay a whole lot more for it and you don't have that disposable income, it becomes a huge threat. You're probably going to do something about it.
These protests seem to be a kind of chain reaction across the Middle East.
For decades, anger has simmered throughout the Arab world. Anger over corrupt governments, poverty, and a lack of freedom.
It's not just this very simple if A, then B. Climate change can be one of the causes in kind of a chain of events scenario, like in the Arab Spring, that exacerbates an already volatile political situation.
Central Cairo, a battlefield.
Bullets were flying around Tahrir Square.
Protesters looted weapons and turned them on police.
The sudden shocks of climate change can lead to disruptions and collapses. So you're going to have fragile social systems that just need one more shock to tip them over the edge into a different configuration, into social breakdown, into war.
We have had, for a couple of generations, a sense that food is not part of politics. This is short term, I'm afraid. The problems that we're having now are unfortunately a small foretaste of what can happen because of the interdependence of climate, economics, and politics. It's generally the case that all societies seem to have trouble thinking about the middle and the long-term future. Since there is a history of catastrophe, when we look at ourselves in the present day, history is the only opportunity that we have for perspective.
When we look back into the historical record, we actually see that the collapse of civilizations, places like Angkor Wat, where whole political systems crumbled, those things seem to have occurred right at the same time that really large-scale global climatic changes were occurring. The Tang Dynasty and the classic Maya civilization collapsed at almost exactly the same time on opposite sides of the Pacific Ocean. There was this large-scale event that led to systematic drying and warming throughout both of these regions, and two great civilizations fell. There was a really coherent, vivid picture about how human society around the world and throughout time has been interacting with the climate. Anywhere we look, we see the same thing. It's probably one of the most repeated findings in the last several years in the field.
Past societies could observe crop failure, but they didn't know how to explain it. What gives us a chance is that we can observe not only local symptoms of a problem, like crop failure, we can also observe the entire globe and draw conclusions. The question is whether we decide we're going to do that or not.
We built society on this implicit assumption of climate stability. Within bounds, we know what we're going to get. We know when to plant. We know about how much rain is going to come. Because we built our society on this climate stability, and that stability is changing, all these things that we take for granted, they're not just givens anymore.
Across the Sahel, the crops have failed. Hunger is stalking tens of millions.
People are abandoning their livestock and moving to wherever they can find water.
Relief workers fear if more help doesn't come soon, millions will starve.
The Sahel is the semi-arid region that stretches from the Atlantic Ocean all the way over to Ethiopia. It's the transition zone between the Sahara and the more humid forested conditions further south. That is a very drought-prone region. There's a lot of people making their livelihood off agriculture. And whenever there are droughts, it leads a lot of people to migrate. The Sahel is already a major conflict zone, both with Islamic militants and also nationalists.
This is the heart of the problem in many ways. Climate change arrives in a world that has already been destabilized.
Darfur, the world's worst humanitarian crisis. More than 2 million people forced to flee their homes in what's widely portrayed as an ethnic conflict. But climatic changes may also be a factor. This is a region where water's getting scarcer and arable land shrinking, pitting Arab nomadic grazers against the predominantly black farmers.
A lot of the violence that is now accelerated by climate change actually has its roots in these older, deeper conflicts.
The drought exacerbated existing societal cleavages. There it was Muslim and Christian. It was the herders versus the agrarians. In every case, climate change acted as a threat multiplier.
The numbers from Darfur are staggering. Since 2003, an estimated 400,000 people have been killed. Another 2.5 million have been forced into refugee camps in neighboring countries like Chad.
Drought and hunger have made communities vulnerable. Coups and rebellions have made it unstable. This fragile state is now threatened by poverty and neglect.
Climate change unfolds on the landscape, making their lives harder. But the poverty that was originally there makes the response to climate change worse.
A staggering 30 million people are thought to survive on Lake Chad's ecosystem. But what was once one of the world's largest lakes has in just 40 years shrunk by 90%.
Lake Chad, where Boko Haram fighters have launched recent attacks.
Water scarcity has caused migration and instability, which Boko Haram has been able to take advantage of.
Where there is already instability, extremists thrive.
More than 1 million people have been forced to flee from Boko Haram's wave of terror.
When you look at the modeling that's being done now for North Africa, we see significantly more drying. We see significant precipitation decline well beyond what it is now.
Africa is a place where very large numbers of people need more land. At the same time, something like half of the unused arable land in the world is in Africa.
Is colonialism taking root in Africa once again? Some of the countries on that continent may be the poorest in the world, but the lush farmlands are the envy of richer nations with infertile soil.
We've already seen in the not so distant past how China, when there's a drought, will panic buy agricultural commodities. What if things were much worse? What if that same country thought that it doesn't just need to panic buy, it needs to buy or lease vast territories? This is a scenario which could unfold gradually without anyone really seeing it coming. Slowly, 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 China controls, at least legally, an awful lot of territory beyond its borders. Whether one wants to moralize and call that a land grab, you can get a situation where local people could have another idea. If you're Chinese authorities, you would rather have instability in Africa than instability at home. We take our lifestyle as being a fixed point. And then if anything's going to change, it's going to be something else, preferably something far away. In the United States, although we've done the most to promote global warming, we're going to get hit by it after other people are going to be hit by it. In advanced societies, we're very vulnerable to confusing lifestyle with life itself.
As the situation in Syria has deteriorated sharply, Jordan's Zaatari camp for Syrian refugees is now the size of a city.
After leaving the army, I worked with refugees on the ground in the Middle East, in Syria, Jordan, Lebanon. Having seen what happens when millions of people uproot and leave a place, the impact it has on them, the impact it has on the country they've taken refuge in, this has major consequences. That on a massive scale, where whole nations are on the move, may be what we're facing in certain climate scenarios.
The world is in the grip of the worst refugee crisis since the Second World War. The vast majority of those refugees are hosted by some of the world's poorest countries.
This camp is just overwhelmed by the amounts of people coming here.
For the refugees, it's been a litany of killings, kidnappings, hunger, and economic chaos.
The UN's Refugee Agency estimates the current total at almost 60 million. Shockingly, half are children.
We don't have the resources to support all the victims of conflict around the world. We are no longer able to pick up the pieces.
The loss of livelihood is definitely a human security risk. In certain situations, it can become an international security risk.
A desperate search for nearly 1,000 people feared dead after a ship packed with migrants capsized in the Mediterranean Sea. It is the latest in a string of deadly migrant boat sinkings.
Refugees fleeing ISIS and other militants trying desperately to cross into Europe.
Italy's Coast Guard and Navy rescued 11,000 people from the Mediterranean in the last week alone.
Europe is suffering a major migration crisis because of the conflicts in Syria, the wider Middle East, and East Africa.
They've been arriving by the boatloads on European shores daily. Now, the head of the UN's Refugee Agency is calling the migrant crisis in the Mediterranean total chaos.
They're willing to risk their lives and their family lives to get to Europe. That's pretty desperate.
It's a refugee crisis with no precedent in the European Union's history.
As their numbers spiral, along with the death count, Europe is under acute pressure to act.
Tensions are at boiling point.
Macedonia closed its border. Special forces fired stun grenades into the crowd.
The EU's response has been criticized. It as at best incoherent and at worst callous and inhumane.
We're going to put in more fencing, more resources.
The politics of the armed lifeboat refers to an acknowledgement that yes, there is a crisis, but no, we are not all in it together. We have to keep the victims of this crisis out so we can carry on as before on the other side of the wall.
What's alarming is the behavior of people in extreme circumstances, taking the risks they do. People in countries where instability was reigning, they feel that they have no other choice.
With the continuing turmoil in the Middle East, the number of desperate people willing to risk everything is expected to rise.
We are so tired. We are very hungry. There is no food. There is no milk for children. There is nothing, okay?
When we really step back, people are pretty much the same. We want adequate food, adequate shelter, safe water. If you have large numbers of displaced people and their needs are not being met, then this becomes a potential for instability.
Who is a climate refugee and who is an economic refugee? It's impossible to say. The two things are bound up together. Most climate refugees are not displaced so clearly by climate change. Rather, it's a mix of forces that drives them off the land.
Under international law, there is no status of climate refugee. Part of this is political, because if there were, then it would compel nations to accept climate migrants as asylees.
The longer that climate change goes on, the more that we feel it, the more that we experience it, people are going to want to come north. The only border which is real is the atmosphere. Everything else is permeable.
Linear thinking says that if you have a change of a certain magnitude in a system, you can predict the change in its output. Nonlinearity says relatively small changes can lead to very large and unpredictable circumstances on the output side. Let's suppose that the rate at which the climate is changing is not linear, but is on a curve that's getting very steep. Take the rate at which Arctic ice is melting, the rate at which the glaciers are retreating. At the beginning of these processes, you create a graph. If I start measuring over time, I keep on discovering things are happening faster than you might expect. And all of our old projections turn out to be excessively conservative. I worry about a discrepancy between the rate at which we set out to deal with these things and the rate at which they are occurring.
What keeps me up at night is a problem of compounding risk. A good example is Bangladesh.
Bangladesh is probably the ground zero of climate change. The impacts are going to be more severe in Bangladesh than many other countries where they have smaller population size.
In a climate scenario where sea level rise occurs, especially if it occurs rapidly, there's a real risk that a large portion of the Bangladeshi population is going to have to move.
The sea level will continue to rise in the coming years because there is melting at a faster rate than ever. If there is a 1 meter sea level rise, Bangladesh will lose about 20% of its landmass. We are going to see a very large climate refugee population. Researchers have estimated the numbers to be above 30 million.
This is a humanitarian crisis of epic proportions. Where are these refugees going to go?
India has already unilaterally fenced Bangladesh on all three sides.
A 10-foot, double-sided, razor wire-topped, what may be the world's first climate fence.
It's inspired by Israel's wall in the West Bank, and it's manned by 80,000 Indian guards. Death can be the penalty for crossing it or even going near it, with hundreds of unarmed villagers killed along what is now one of the most dangerous frontiers in the world.
There are other reasons for India to build that fence, but probably the most pressing and strategic reason is to forestall that climate migration.
No factor can be excluded from the impacts of climate change. We have got to see the consequences of the consequences. We're going to see multiple stresses coming at one point at one time. Stress on the water sector, food sector, physical infrastructure. That could lead to a state collapse. It will be a problem of the magnitude that will destabilize not only Bangladesh, but it will severely impact on international stability, having consequences beyond imagination.
We don't now have the luxury, and we probably never will, of sort of isolating one driver of a situation and saying, okay, let's solve for that driver. We're always going to be dealing with a layer cake of interconnected problems. So if you have a climate change scenario that's sufficient to raise the sea level in Bangladesh, what is that temperature spike doing to the Himalayan ice caps that supply the annual water cycle for most of the agriculture production in the Asia-Pacific region? So now you've got potential drought and food scarcity in one area that's intersecting with flooding and massive refugee flows in the other area. What's the political situation when it happens? If India and China are continuing to have a border dispute during this period of time, that border dispute just got a lot more serious. This is something that could place massive stress on the international system. It's these compounding risk factors, these compounding dynamics that I think ought to really concern us.
If you look at issues of water flow from the Himalayan plateau, there are countries that are on the receiving end of those flows of water that are nuclear armed. If the supply of water becomes increasingly tight, then if somebody decides to build a dam on their side, that can look to somebody on the losing end like an act of war. The risk of any conflict in the modern world is magnified by the fact that at the end of a chain of escalation, you might arrive at countries that have weapons of mass destruction.
What keeps me up at night is the possibility that we'll have a world where the risks associated with climate change are so dire and so potentially unmanageable that governments start acting in ways that are authoritarian. That's a world that I don't want to live in. That's a world I don't want my children to live in. And it's a world that we see in these scenarios that the United States military produces.
We're at war with the most dangerous enemy that has ever faced mankind in his long climb from the swamp to the stars. And it's been said if we lose that war, and in so doing lose this way of freedom of ours, history will record with the greatest astonishment that those who had the most to lose did the least to prevent its happening.
We spent billions of dollars of our GDP during the Cold War to reduce the threat of nuclear attack, which is low probability but very high consequence. Now we face risks from climate change that are arguably as severe and of higher probability. And yet there is, in some quarters, a reluctance to face up to the challenges and build a resilient society.
Whether it's threats from nuclear weapons or international terrorist organizations, any percentage is unacceptable. When you think about climate change as a risk management issue, then all of the actions we need to take are going to be on the table. If we don't, then we're going to have to make some very, very difficult choices.
Where can we make ourselves more resilient? Where can we make ourselves more prepared? Where can we act now in order to mitigate the consequences of decisions that were made since the Industrial Revolution? There's a difficult truth we've got to face here. As we've seen rising awareness of the problem, we've continued to accelerate our contribution. Reversing that may be the most difficult collective action problem we've ever faced.
I do think the biggest threat is climate change in its national security aspects. Our problem is that not everything can be handled militarily, and that we also have a short attention span. These are very long-term problems.
This is a whole of society issue. We have to address it in all of our institutions. That means all aspects of government. It means the resources and the political will.
It is a matter of cooperating, and if you look at these issues, it will require American leadership within a system that other countries play a part in.
We have to lead. The industrialized countries, we're the ones who are doing the vast majority of the polluting here in the world. We've got to step up to this.
Every aspect of national security is about managing risk. Our politicians, in my opinion, should take a lesson from the military. They should start prudent action to reduce emissions.
Congress won't lead on this issue, but they can be led. That's why I continue to go around and talk about this issue. We need to find policy solutions that can deal with it.
One of the things that I find personally really distressing, having worked for Republicans and Democrats, is that something that should be a point of convergence has become so divisive. This polarization has allowed us to not really address what we really need to do. Resilience and improving our ability to respond, those are the least that we should be doing. That's, in military parlance, the first line of defense.
One of the first things they ever taught me as a combat leader was choosing to do nothing is a choice. Inaction is as much of a decision as any other course of action, and it carries those consequences.
It's a very dangerous thing to decide that there is one and only one line of events heading into the future, and one and only one best response for dealing with that. When systems become invested in an old way of thinking, there is a moment when those structures start to break down. The system resists the idea of change to a certain point, and then the weight of collective experience says, something's not working here, we need a change. I don't think you get to that moment by slow degrees. I think it occurs like an avalanche. And there comes a moment when you have to know when to change course.
Even as we spend all of our time talking about what humans are capable of doing in a negative sense, we don't know the limits of what we're capable of doing in a positive sense. We haven't found that either. The general drift is in the wrong direction. We have an awful lot of things that we should be afraid of. The window of action is closing, but there wouldn't be any point talking about all of this if we didn't have the knowledge, which we do, if we didn't have the tools, which we do, and if we didn't have unpredictable potential, which we also do.
What people need more than a fright is some credible description of a way out of the problem.
Energy independence fundamentally is about the ability to meet our energy needs from within our own borders indefinitely. There's no more American concept than that. And that means taking control of our energy future and investing in alternatives to our current system.
The flip side of the climate threat is the energy and resilience opportunity. The more diversified we are in our energy sources, from a whole array of renewables to innovative technologies, the sounder and stronger, more secure we will be.
One of the things we've seen is a whole generation of veterans who've come back from the conflicts in Iraq and Afghanistan with a very deep personal understanding of this challenge. We've seen returning veterans go into the renewable energy industry, installing solar panels and starting companies. They see not only the technology of the future, but they also see a mission. They see a continuation of public service that drove them to raise their hand and volunteer to put in the uniform in the first place.
We did not end the Stone Age because we ran out of stones. We found something better. Winston Churchill is alleged to have said that Americans can always be counted upon to do the right thing, after exhausting every other possibility. We're getting towards the end of exhausting all those other possibilities.
The response to climate change involves a type of industrial revolution. We need to leave behind the technologies based on fossil fuels and shift towards a clean tech renaissance. The path forward already exists.
If you look at the rate at which the technology is improving, this actually is an economic boom. Doing what we should proactively to deal with climate change becomes part of the solution set to what we should be doing proactively to deal with the economic strength of the country.
These are the plays that are going to define the 21st century either way. We'll improve our security, we'll improve our way of life, we'll improve our economy. We may also head off one of the largest risks we face.
The most important thing is for people to see how actually tangible and like within possible grasp this change is.